The merciless Arizona sun reached its zenith, transforming the desert into a furnace that could drain the life from a man in mere hours. Clara Taylor's head emerged from the sun-baked soil like a grotesque desert bloom, her 15-year-old face streaked with tears that evaporated instantly in the scorching heat. The rest of her small body lay entombed beneath the hard-packed earth, trapped in a grave designed for the living. "Please," she whispered through lips already cracking from dehydration, her voice barely audible above the wind that sent dust devils spinning across the barren flats. "I swear, on my father's soul, I never took anything from anyone." The circle of weathered men surrounding her showed no mercy in their sun-hardened faces. Sheriff Hawkins, his star-shaped badge tarnished and dull, spat a stream of tobacco juice dangerously close to her exposed head. "Thieves get what's coming to them, girl. Maybe watching you bake will teach the rest of this settlement some respect for what little we got left." Behind him stood Deputy Pete Morley, nervously adjusting his grip on a Winchester rifle. His pale eyes darting between Clara and the jagged escarpments that rose like ancient monuments around their small valley. Deputy Collins flanked Hawkins's other side, his weathered hand steady on his weapon, but his expression troubled as if some part of him recognized the wrongness of what they were doing. Elder Morrison himself had overseen the punishment, his black preacher's coat hanging loose on his gaunt frame, his gray beard neatly trimmed despite the harsh conditions that had turned other men wild and unkempt. His son Jacob stood slightly apart from the group, his young face pale with what looked like guilt rather than satisfaction. "The drought's been killing us for 2 years running." Morrison intoned his voice, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "When food goes missing from our common stores, someone pays the price. Justice must be swift and visible, or we'll have chaos." Clara's mind drifted to her dying mother, lying in their single-room shack burning with fever and growing weaker each day from the same consumption that had claimed her father. The thought of her mother dying alone while she baked to death in this makeshift grave filled her with a desperation that transcended physical pain. "Mrs. Henderson saw me drawing water from the well yesterday evening," Clara said, her voice growing hoarse. "She can tell you I was nowhere near the food stores when the theft happened. Mrs. Henderson's been touched in the head since her husband died." Hawkins replied dismissively. Her word don't count for nothing. But Clara knew the real reason her testimony wouldn't be heard. The Henderson family, like the Taylors, existed on the margins of their small community. They were the poor, the different, the ones who could be sacrificed when desperate times demanded someone pay the price for everyone's suffering. As the men began to mount their horses, preparing to leave her to die slowly under the desert sun, none of them noticed the solitary figure observing from a wind-scoured valley nearly a mile away. The Apache warrior sat motionless on his painted pony, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the cruel scene unfolding below. Dasan recognized the girl immediately, and the memory of what she had done for his family burned in his chest with the intensity of a brand. At 24, he carried the scars of more battles than most men twice his age. But his deepest wounds came not from enemy weapons, but from the rejection of his own people. 6 months earlier, his Apache clan had cast him out for the crime of advocating peace with the white settlers. While other warriors spoke of driving the invaders back across the great waters, Dasan had argued for coexistence, for finding ways to share the harsh land that killed the foolish and unprepared with equal indifference. His elders called him weak, a warrior who had forgotten the taste of proper vengeance. They were wrong about his weakness, but their words had cut deeper than any blade. The fresh wound on his shoulder, still tender from last week's skirmish with a settler patrol, served as a constant reminder of the violence that seemed to follow him wherever he rode. He had been trying to prevent bloodshed when the patrol attacked his small band, but his attempts at diplomacy had only resulted in more death and his own injury. Now, watching Clara's head disappear behind settling dust as the men rode away, Dasan felt the memory that bound him to her rise like smoke from a hidden fire. It had happened during the autumn moon, when his younger sister Ayanna had taken a settler's bullet through her chest during a raid she wasn't even supposed to participate in. The wound had festered despite their medicine man's best efforts, and infection set in with the relentless certainty of death itself. Desperate beyond all reason, Dasan had carried his 15-year-old sister to the edge of Broken Springs under cover of darkness, hoping to find someone among the white settlers who possessed the healing knowledge their people lacked. Most Apaches would have considered such an act not just desperate, but treasonous, seeking help from the very people who were stealing their ancestral lands and killing their families. Clara had found them there in the moonlight, drawn by Ayanna's fevered cries that she could hear from her family's shack at the settlement's edge. The girl had looked at the wounded Apache with the same compassionate eyes her father had once used, seeing pain instead of skin color need, instead of tribal markings. Without hesitation or apparent fear, she had disappeared back into the settlement. When she returned 20 minutes later, her arms were full of precious supplies that could have meant exile or worse if her theft had been discovered. Clean bandages that smelled of lye soap bottles of medicine, that burned sharp and clean in the nostrils. And most importantly, the knowledge her father had passed down about treating such wounds before consumption claimed him 2 years prior. Clara had worked through the entire night, her small hands steady and sure, as she cleaned the infected wound, applied antiseptic that made Ayanna cry out in pain, and carefully rewrapped the injury with proper technique. When dawn painted the eastern sky pink and gold, Ayanna's fever had broken, and the dangerous red lines of infection had begun to fade from around the wound site. Why, Dasan had asked in his broken English, genuinely puzzled by such kindness from a people who usually showed Apaches nothing but hatred and fear. My father taught me that pain has no color. Clara had replied, simply packing up her supplies. He treated wounded men regardless of which side they fought for, because suffering makes everyone equal. She had refused any payment, asking only that he keep her involvement secret to protect her family from the community's likely retaliation. That act of mercy had saved not just Ayanna's life, but had also planted a seed in Dasan's mind about the possibility of peace between their peoples, a seed that had ultimately led to his exile when he spoke of it too often and too publicly. Now those same people who had benefited from Dr. Taylor's healing hands had buried his daughter alive for a crime Dasan strongly suspected she had never committed. The debt between them demanded payment, and no Apache warrior worthy of the name could ride away from such a sacred obligation. He urged his horse down the treacherous slope, his mind already calculating distances and angles, counting enemies and weighing odds. His shoulder wound ached with each movement, reminding him that he was not at full strength for what lay ahead. But the code of his people was clear: a life debt must be honored regardless of personal cost. The settlement's men would return to check on their victims' progress toward death, and when they did, they would find far more than a dying girl waiting in the desert heat. They would find an Apache warrior with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Dasan reached Clara just as her eyelids began to flutter, consciousness fading under the desert's brutal assault. Her lips had turned white as old bone, and her breathing came in short, desperate gasps that spoke of advanced dehydration. The sight of her suffering filled him with a cold fury that reminded him why his people called him dangerous, despite his advocacy for peace. He dismounted quickly and began digging with his bare hands, the sun-baked earth resisting his efforts like hardened clay. Each handful revealed more stones and gnarled roots that cut his fingers and slowed his progress. But he worked with the methodical urgency of a warrior who understood that time was not his ally. "Stay with me," he said in English, his accent thick but his words clear. "You saved my sister's life. Now I repay that debt." Clara's eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus on his face. When recognition dawned, a flicker of something not fear, but surprise crossed her features. "Apache," she whispered. "The same Apache whose sister you healed with your father's medicine," Dasan replied, his hands never pausing in their desperate work. "The debt between us must be settled." As he dug deeper, his fingertips scraped against something unexpected. A folded piece of paper tucked carefully into Clara's dress, near her heart, positioned where she could protect it, even while buried alive. He pulled it free and unfolded it with dirt-stained fingers, his limited reading skills struggling with the hurried English script. What he saw there made his blood turn cold with understanding. The letter was a confession signed in Jacob Morrison's unmistakable handwriting. The young man had stolen food multiple times over the past 3 months, driven by gambling debts he had accumulated during weekly poker games with traders passing through the settlement. More damning still, the letter revealed that Clara had witnessed one of these thefts and confronted Jacob privately, demanding he confess or face exposure. The letter was Jacob's attempt to buy her silence, promising to make restitution if she would give him time to arrange his affairs without his father's knowledge. But Clara had kept the confession as insurance against exactly what had happened, being falsely accused and punished, while the real thief went free. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Dasan quickly refold the letter and secure it inside his own shirt. This time, it wasn't 3 men returning the dust cloud on the horizon, spoke of a much larger force, at least 8 or 9 riders all armed and riding hard toward their position. "Clara," he said urgently, his hands working frantically to free her legs from the packed earth. "I found your letter. I know about Jacob Morrison and what he did." Her eyes snapped open with more alertness than before. "Then you know why they really want me dead," she whispered. "It's not about the food. It's about protecting the Morrison family's reputation and power in this settlement." Dasan nodded grimly as he finally pulled her free from the earth that had served as her temporary grave. Clara's body was limp and burning with fever, but she was alive and conscious enough to understand their desperate situation. "Can you ride?" he asked, already knowing the answer from her condition. "I don't think I can even stand," Clara admitted, trying to push herself up and failing. "Leave me here and go. You've done more than anyone else would have. Apache warriors don't abandon their debts." Dasan replied firmly, lifting her in his arms and carrying her toward his horse. "And I won't let you die for another man's crimes." The approaching riders were close enough now that he could make out individual figures. Elder Morrison rode at their head, his black coat flapping behind him like the wings of a carrion bird. Sheriff Hawkins flanked him on one side, his face set in grim determination, while Jacob Morrison rode on the other, his young features twisted with an expression that mixed fear and guilt in equal measure. Behind them came 6 more men, including Deputy Collins and Pete Morley, all carrying rifles and wearing the hard expressions of men who had decided that murder was easier to explain than corruption. They weren't coming to recapture Clara and return her to her punishment. They were coming to ensure that both she and Dasan disappeared forever, along with any evidence that might threaten the established order in Broken Springs. Dasan helped Clara onto his horse and swung up behind her, his wounded shoulder protesting the movement. The animal was strong and fast, but carrying 2 riders would slow them considerably in any chase across open ground. Their only hope lay in reaching the maze of canyons and dry washes that cut through the landscape like ancient scars terrain, where an Apache warrior's knowledge of the land might overcome the disadvantage of numbers and firepower. "Hold on tight," he told Clara, wrapping one arm around her waist while controlling the reins with his other hand. "We're going to ride hard, and I need you to stay conscious." As they galloped toward the canyon system, Clara pressed back against his chest and spoke into the wind, rushing past their faces. "There's something else about the letter you should know. Jacob wasn't just stealing food, he was selling some of it to buy whiskey and maintain his gambling habit. And his father knew. Elder Morrison had to know." This revelation hit Dasan like a physical blow. If Morrison had known about his son's crimes and chosen to let an innocent girl take the blame, then the corruption ran deeper than simple family protection. The elder was willing to commit murder to preserve not just his son's future, but his own authority and reputation as the settlement's moral leader. Behind them, rifle shots cracked like whips, the bullets whining past their heads and kicking up sprays of sand from the hard-pan desert floor. One shot came close enough to burn through the edge of Dasan's shirt, the heat of its passing searing against his ribs. "They're trying to kill us both." Clara said, her voice steadier, now that adrenaline was fighting off the effects of her ordeal. "Morrison can't let either of us live to tell what really happened." Dasan urged his horse faster as they approached the mouth of Devil's Canyon, a narrow passage between towering red rock walls that had been carved over centuries by flash floods. The Apache had used these canyons for generations, turning them into death traps for unwary enemies who didn't understand the dangers of fighting in such confined spaces. As they entered the canyon system, the walls rose 50 feet on either side, carved by ancient waters into smooth, undulating curves that trapped sound and created confusing echoes. Dasan's ears, trained by years of survival in hostile territory, picked up something that made his jaw tighten with additional concern. A distant rumble that wasn't quite thunder growing steadily stronger from the north. The dark clouds that had been building over the mountains all day were finally ready to deliver their burden of rain. In the high country, sudden storms could dump enormous amounts of water in very short periods, sending flash floods racing down these very canyons at speeds that could strip flesh from bone. "Listen," Dasan told Clara, pulling his horse to a halt in a section where the canyon walls narrowed to barely 20 feet across. "Do you hear that sound?" Clara tilted her head, concentrating despite her exhaustion. The distant rumble was barely audible over their own breathing and the echoing hoofbeats of their pursuers, but it was definitely growing louder. "Thunder," she guessed. "Flash flood," Dasan corrected. "The storm in the mountains is sending water this way. These canyons will become rivers in less than an hour." Clara's eyes widened as she grasped the implications. "Then we need to get to higher ground immediately." "No," Dasan said, a grim smile crossing his face. "We need to make sure we're the only ones who reach higher ground." The first of their pursuers appeared at the canyon entrance, silhouetted against the desert sky beyond. Elder Morrison led the charge, his black coat now dusty and torn, his face set in lines of murderous determination. Sheriff Hawkins and the others spread out behind him in a rough line, their rifles' ready eyes scanning the towering walls for signs of an ambush. End of the line, Apache. Morrison called out, his voice echoing off the stone walls with an authority that brooked no defiance. "There's nowhere left to run." Dasan helped Clara down from his horse and positioned her behind a fallen log that provided meager cover near the canyon wall. The defensive position wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. He checked his weapons. His rifle held 12 rounds, plus his bow with 8 arrows, and the knife at his belt that had saved his life more times than he could count. "There's something you need to know about your son's crimes and this girl's innocence," Dasan called back, stepping partially into view while keeping most of his body behind a boulder. His hand moved toward the letter hidden inside his shirt. "I don't need to know anything except that you're interfering with our justice," Morrison replied, but his eyes flicked nervously toward Jacob, who sat his horse with the pallor of a man facing his worst nightmares. "Your justice." Dasan's voice carried contempt that cut through the canyon's echoes like a blade. "What kind of justice buries an innocent girl while the real thief rides free beside you?" Jacob Morrison's nerve finally snapped completely. "Pa, he knows," the young man cried, his voice rising to a panicked whine that bounced off the canyon walls. "He knows about the confession letter Clara kept about all the times I took food to pay my gambling debts. We have to kill them both, or the whole settlement will learn the truth." Elder Morrison's face went white with fury. Not at his son's crimes, but at his stupidity in confessing them in front of witnesses who could carry the story back to town. "Shut your mouth, you fool, you've said more than enough." But the damage was already done. The other men exchanged glances, understanding dawning in their weathered faces. Deputy Collins lowered his rifle, slightly confusion replacing the certainty that had driven him this far. "Wait just a minute," Collins said slowly, his voice carrying across the canyon. "Are you saying the girl didn't steal that food, that Jacob Morrison—" Jacob did what circumstances forced him to do. Morrison snapped, but his voice carried the desperation of a man watching his authority crumble. "And I did what I had to do to protect this community from chaos. Sometimes hard choices must be made for the greater good." Sheriff Hawkins studied Morrison with new eyes, finally seeing the corruption that had been hidden beneath the elder's religious authority. "You knew," he said, his voice filled with disgust. "You knew she was innocent, and you let us bury her alive anyway." The rumble from the north was much louder now, no longer distant thunder, but the unmistakable roar of approaching water. Dark clouds had gathered over the canyon, and the first heavy drops of rain began to patter against the stone walls like an irregular drumbeat. But Dasan's attention remained focused on the sound that made his Apache-trained ears prick with alarm, and the deep, continuous roar that spoke of thousands of tons of water racing toward them at deadly speed. "You want to talk about justice?" Dasan called out, backing toward the narrow passage, while keeping his rifle trained on Morrison. "Sometimes the desert delivers justice herself." Morrison's eyes widened as he finally recognized the approaching sound. Years of living in flash flood country had taught him to fear that particular rumble, but his desperation made him reckless. "Kill them both now," he screamed at his men. "Before that water gets here." Instead of retreating in an orderly fashion that might have saved their lives, panic overtook several of the riders. Sheriff Hawkins spurred his horse forward, trying to ride down Dasan before the flood could reach them. Pete Morley circled left, his rifle firing wild shots that sparked off the canyon walls and filled the air with stone chips and ricocheting lead. Dasan used their confusion to his advantage, moving with the fluid grace that had kept him alive through countless battles. His first arrow took Sheriff Hawkins through the shoulder, spinning the lawman from his saddle to land hard against a cluster of barrel cacti. The sharp spines pierced his clothing and skin, leaving him unable to stand, while blood seeped from dozens of puncture wounds. A second arrow brought down Pete Morley's horse, sending both rider and mount tumbling across the rocky canyon floor. Morley rolled clear of his falling animal, but came up with his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle, clearly broken from the impact. Deputy Collins, seeing the chaos around him and finally understanding the full scope of Morrison's corruption, threw down his rifle and raised his hands. "I'm out," he shouted. "This ain't justice, it's murder, and I won't be part of it." But Elder Morrison, seeing his carefully constructed world of power and authority collapsing around him, raised his own rifle with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. "If we're all going to die in this canyon, at least I'll take you with me, Apache." The roar of approaching water was deafening now, drowning out the men's shouts and the crack of gunfire. Morrison squeezed his trigger. Just as Dasan dove behind the boulder cluster, the bullet chipping stone inches from his head. Then the flash flood arrived with the devastating force of an avalanche. A wall of brown water 20 feet high exploded into view, carrying boulders the size of wagons, uprooted trees, and the accumulated debris of the mountain storm. It struck the wider section of canyon with the sound of 1,000 cannons firing at once, instantly swallowing 3 riders and their mounts without leaving so much as a ripple to mark their passing. Elder Morrison had time for one last scream of rage and defiance before the water claimed him, his black coat disappearing beneath the churning surface like a raven pulled into hell. Jacob Morrison, mounted on a faster horse, tried to outrun the flood, but was caught when his animal stumbled on loose rock. The young man's confession of guilt was the last coherent sound he made before the waters silenced him forever. Dasan grabbed Clara and pulled her higher up the rocky slope as the flood roared past below them, the sound drowning out everything else in the world. They clung to each other and to the stone as spray soaked them, and the canyon shook with the terrible power of water unleashed. Sheriff Hawkins, despite his wounds, managed to crawl high enough up the opposite canyon wall to avoid drowning, though the effort left him unconscious from pain and exhaustion. Deputy Collins, who had thrown down his weapon, helped Pete Morley reach safety, despite the man's broken arm, both of them understanding that survival trumped everything else in the face of such natural fury. When the roar finally began to fade, leaving only the steady patter of rain and the distant rumble of thunder, 4 people remained alive in a canyon that had been scoured clean by the flood's passage. Below them, the canyon floor showed only smooth stone and scattered debris to mark where 8 men had met their end in the space of a few terrifying minutes. The rain continued for another hour, washing the blood from Dasan's wounds and bringing blessed relief from the desert heat that had nearly killed Clara. She helped him bind his injuries with strips torn from her dress, the bullet wound in his thigh where he had been grazed during the chase, the reopened cut on his shoulder from his earlier battle, and numerous cuts on his hands from digging her out of the hard-packed earth. As the storm moved eastward, and they made their way carefully out of the canyon system, avoiding areas where flash floods might still pose danger. Clara walked with Dasan's support, her legs shaky but functional, her spirit growing stronger with each step away from the grave that had nearly claimed her life. They found Morrison's horse wandering riderless near the canyon mouth, its reins tangled in a mesquite bush. The animal was unharmed, but nervous, shying away from the scent of Apache, until Dasan spoke to it in the gentle tones that worked with horses, regardless of their training. Deputy Collins, his arm around the injured Pete Morley, intercepted them as they made their slow way back toward the settlement. The deputy's face showed none of the hatred or racial hostility from before, only the exhausted relief of a man who had survived something that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Apache. Collins said, his voice hoarse from shouting over the flood's roar. Thank God you both made it out alive. I heard what Jacob Morrison confessed back there about the stealing and the gambling debts. People need to know what really happened. Collins's survival proved crucial in the days that followed. His testimony, combined with Jacob Morrison's written confession that Dasan had preserved through the battle and flood, painted a clear picture of corruption and injustice that even the most prejudiced settlers couldn't ignore or explain away. The visiting circuit judge, who arrived 3 days later, as scheduled for his monthly court session, conducted a thorough investigation that vindicated Clara completely and exposed the full scope of the Morrison family's corruption. Judge William Crawford was a man who had seen enough frontier justice to recognize injustice when it was presented to him, and his reputation for fairness had survived 15 years of riding circuit through Arizona territory. Miss Taylor, Judge Crawford said during the formal hearing that cleared her name, not only were you innocent of any wrongdoing, but your courage in preserving evidence of the real crime helped expose corruption that might have continued for years. This court formally apologizes for the injustice you suffered. The judge imposed substantial fines on the settlement for their illegal punishment of an innocent person and ordered the establishment of proper legal procedures to prevent such abuses in the future. Several of the men who had participated in Clara's burial faced charges of attempted murder, though the deaths in the canyon were ruled acts of nature rather than homicide. More importantly, for the Taylor family's immediate survival, the territorial government provided medical supplies and financial compensation as part of the court's judgment. Clara's mother, rallying with the news of her daughter's vindication and the promise of proper medical care, began to recover from her illness with the help of medicine that had previously been beyond their reach. Word of the events spread throughout Arizona territory, carried by traders, soldiers, and drifters who passed through Broken Springs. The story grew in the telling, as frontier stories always did, but the core remained true. An Apache warrior had risked his life to save an innocent white girl, and the desert itself had delivered justice to those who perverted it in the name of community order. 3 weeks after the flood, Dasan returned to Broken Springs one final time. His wounds had healed well, leaving only slight scars and a barely noticeable limp that would fade with time. His horse carried fresh supplies for a long journey, and his eyes held the peaceful resolution of a man whose debts had been honorably settled. Clara was waiting for him at the settlement's edge, her skin tanned healthy brown by the desert sun, her dark eyes bright with recovered strength and newfound purpose. She wore a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, and her hair was braided with small wildflowers that bloomed only after the desert rains, a sign of hope and renewal in the harsh landscape. "I heard you were leaving," she said, walking beside his horse, as he rode slowly toward the horizon, where mountains rose like purple shadows against the evening sky. "My people are moving north, following the game herds toward their winter grazing grounds," Dasan replied. "And your people?" He gestured toward the settlement behind them. "They're not ready for an Apache to live among them, not yet. Perhaps not ever." Clara nodded, understanding the wisdom in his words, even as her heart protested the unfairness of it all. "Will I ever see you again?" Dasan reined in his horse and looked down at her, his dark eyes holding a warmth that few white settlers had ever seen in Apache features. From his leather pouch, he drew a single eagle feather perfectly white, except for the black tip, its surface gleaming in the fading sunlight. "In my people's tradition, the eagle feather represents courage and protection," he said, holding it out to her, with the reverence due to a sacred object. "It's also a promise that the eagle watches over those who cannot protect themselves." Clara accepted the feather with both hands, understanding instinctively that this was more than a simple gift or token of friendship. What kind of promise? That if innocent blood is spilled again in this place, if the strong prey upon the weak without cause or justice, the eagle will return. Dasan's voice carried quiet certainty, the absolute conviction of a warrior making a sacred vow. "And with the eagle will come the storm that washes clean the sins of men." He touched his fingers to his forehead in a gesture of deep respect, then turned his horse toward the mountains. Clara watched him ride away until he became a speck against the red rocks, then disappeared entirely into the vast landscape that had shaped him into the man who saved her life. Years passed like seasons in the desert, some harsh, some gentle, but all marked by the gradual changes that time brings to every settled place. Clara grew into a woman respected throughout the territory for her fairness, courage, and unwavering advocacy for those who had no voice in community affairs. She used the compensation money from the territorial government to establish a small school that welcomed children regardless of their family's status or background, and later founded a clinic that provided medical care to anyone in need, following the example her father had set. She married Dr. Michael Henderson, a young physician who came to Broken Springs specifically because he had heard about her work and wanted to be part of building something better than what had come before. Together, they raised 4 children who grew up knowing that justice and mercy were not abstract concepts, but practical necessities for any community that wanted to survive and thrive. The eagle feather held a place of honor in their home, mounted in a simple frame above the fireplace, where visitors could see it and hear its story. Clara told that story often, especially to those who spoke of treating others with cruelty or contempt, whether based on race poverty or simply being different from the majority. Most dismissed it as frontier folklore, the kind of tale that grew wilder with each telling around campfires and in saloons across the territory. But throughout Arizona and New Mexico, other stories began to circulate, stories of a mysterious Apache warrior who appeared in times of crisis, always when the innocent faced persecution from those in power. The Mexican rancher whose corrupt overseer was found dead after years of systematically cheating workers out of their wages spoke of finding a single white eagle feather pinned to the man's shirt. The mining company that tried to steal water rights from a small farming community discovered such a feather on their surveyor's tent after their equipment mysteriously disappeared, and evidence of their illegal activities was delivered to the territorial authorities. A cavalry officer who had been selling army rifles to renegade bands found another feather on his pillow, along with detailed records of his crimes delivered directly to his commanding general. In every case, justice followed swiftly and decisively, as if the desert itself had taken note of wrongdoing and decided to act. Clara kept these stories to herself, but she smiled each time she heard them, touching the feather in the locket she wore close to her heart and feeling the presence of the guardian eagle that watched over the vast spaces between settlements. She had been saved by an Apache warrior's honor, and in return she had become the keeper of his legend and the living proof that mercy could triumph over hatred when good people chose to act with courage. When Clara died at the age of 68, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up hearing her stories, her last words were about the feather and the promise it represented. Her family buried it, with her not fully understanding its significance, but respecting her final wish that it remain with her always. But legends like eagles are not easily contained by graves or human understanding. Within a month of Clara's funeral, travelers began reporting a familiar sight on the desert horizon, a lone rider on a painted pony, moving through the heat shimmer like a ghost of justice incarnate. Some claimed it was the same Apache warrior preserved by desert magic and sacred vows. Others believed it was his son or his son's son, carrying on a family tradition of protection that stretched back generations. The truth was both simpler and more complex than either explanation could capture. The desert remembered those who had served it well, and it had ways of ensuring that certain debts were never forgotten, certain promises never broken. In the endless cycle of sand and stone, wind and water, justice had found its perfect guardian, not a single man, but an enduring ideal that could take human form when the need was greatest. And somewhere in the vast Arizona territory, when the sun set just right and the wind carried the scent of distant storms, travelers still occasionally reported seeing that lone figure riding the high ridgelines, watching over the innocent, with eyes as sharp as obsidian and a heart as vast and enduring as the desert sky itself. The eagle's promise lived on as true as the day it was first given, as permanent and unchanging as the stars that guided warriors home through the darkness toward the light of dawn.